The heavy rains over Ouagadougou had subsided, leaving the city soaked in silence, but the presidential office was anything but quiet. President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of his command table, eyes fixed on a decrypted cable from Mossad. The message was short but chilling. Israel expects cooperation. Denial will be seen as hostility. Traoré placed the file down slowly. He had faced military coups, internal dissent, and regional instability. But this was different. This was international pressure masked as diplomacy. And the one behind it wasn't just any foreign leader. It was Benjamin Netanyahu. For months, Israel had courted Burkina Faso behind the scenes. The official reason? Intelligence sharing and infrastructure development. But beneath the surface, the game was darker. Israel wanted access to rare earth minerals buried deep beneath Burkina soil, and they wanted military positioning near Sahel borders under the guise of counterterrorism. Traoré wasn't naive. He knew the playbook. What started as collaboration often ended with dependency, and in a post-colonial Africa rising to its feet, that was a price Traoré was unwilling to pay. "Summon the council," he told his chief of staff. "Tonight." The room filled swiftly, military commanders, intelligence chiefs, and civilian advisors. The air was tense. The president didn't waste time. Netanyahu is pushing for a base in the east, disguised as logistics support. If we give him a finger, they'll take the whole arm. General Yago shifted uneasily. But they're offering advanced weapons, anti-drone systems, and training. That could save hundreds of our troops in the north. Traoré stared him down. And what will it cost us? Our land, our sovereignty, our silence when Tel Aviv bombs Gaza again? The room went dead silent. "We won't be pawns in their games," Traoré continued. "Africa won't kneel, not to Paris, not to Washington, and not to Tel Aviv." Outside, lightning split the sky once more. It was as if the storm hadn't truly ended. In a villa on the outskirts of the city, an Israeli operative, posing as a telecom consultant, made a hurried call back to Jerusalem. "He's resisting," he whispered. "Traoré's pushing back hard." The voice on the other end was cold. "Then apply pressure, or break him." In the dimly lit situation room beneath the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré reviewed satellite images provided by Burkina Faso's limited intelligence network. 3 unmarked planes had landed in Niamey, Niger's capital, within the last 48 hours. None were on civilian registries. "We have confirmation," whispered Director Awa Kouyaté, head of internal security. "Mossad is moving assets through Niger. They're coordinating with local proxies, possibly even arming rebel cells near our border." Traoré's jaw clenched. "And their objective? To destabilize. Force your hand. Show the West you're not in control of your own territory." Across the Atlantic, in Tel Aviv, Benjamin Netanyahu watched the same satellite feeds, except his came with more precision and heat signatures. He smiled faintly as his top intelligence advisor debriefed him. "Traoré refuses to cooperate. He's rallying Pan-African sentiment, speaking with Mali and Guinea. If they form a united bloc, then we crush it before it starts," Netanyahu said coldly. "Destabilize his military, discredit him internationally, push the authoritarian narrative. Africa doesn't get to say no." Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré met quietly with his closest allies, Colonel Doumbouya of Guinea and Assimi Goïta of Mali. The 3 men, often painted as military strongmen by Western media, understood what was at stake. "We are not anti-West," Goïta said. "We are pro-Africa. They want our resources, our land, our compliance," Doumbouya added. "And now they test our will." Traoré nodded. "Then we show them what resistance looks like." Within days, he gave a rare televised address. Standing in front of a wall painted with the colors of the Burkina flag, he looked into the camera not as a politician, but as a soldier. "To those who pressure us, know this: we are not for sale. Not our soil, not our silence. We will resist. We will build with those who respect our dignity, not those who seek to own it. The broadcast went viral across West Africa, but in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu was already orchestrating a response. A confidential memo was sent to a group of high-ranking journalists in Paris and London. Traoré's regime is becoming increasingly hostile. Evidence suggests growing ties with Russia, Iran. Sanctions should be considered. The media machine had been activated. The war for Africa's voice had just begun, and Traoré was now at the center of it. The nights in Ouagadougou had grown colder, not in temperature, but in trust. Traoré's inner circle was beginning to fracture under the weight of surveillance, infiltration, and psychological warfare. False intelligence had become a weapon as dangerous as bullets. At 3 a.m., Traoré was awoken by a sharp knock at his secure residence. Colonel Idriss Tapsoba, head of cyber intelligence, entered breathless. "They've breached our satellite relay systems," he said. "Not just surveillance, manipulation. Video feeds are being doctored. It's deep fake level. They're preparing to release proof that you accepted Russian military aid for personal gain." Traoré's face hardened. "Disinformation warfare." "And worse," Idriss said. "We have a mole, possibly more than one." That same morning, Western media exploded with headlines. Traoré's secret deal with the Kremlin revealed. Africa's young leader turns toward authoritarian allies. Burkina Faso at risk of becoming the next Belarus. It was textbook. Fabricate a scandal, flood the airwaves, discredit the voice that dared speak against the empire. Meanwhile, in Israel, Netanyahu met with a private delegation of energy executives. Maps of West African lithium deposits covered the table. "He's a liability," one executive said. "We need a friendlier regime, someone who'll sign the contracts without speeches." Netanyahu didn't blink. "Then make him fall." Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré was in a room full of generals, some loyal, some quiet. He looked each man in the eye. "We are at war, but not a war of tanks and bombs. A war of perception, of truth. And we are surrounded, not just by enemies from afar, but by shadows within." He paused. "Find the traitors, expose them. No mercy." Within 48 hours, 2 mid-ranking officers were arrested. A laptop found in one of their quarters revealed communications with a Tel Aviv-based IP address, coded messages, bribes, the beginnings of a coup. But Traoré knew this was only the first layer. At night, alone in his war room, he looked at a digital map, points flashing across Niger, Ghana, and Burkina Faso. Each point marked unrest, each one a thread pulled by invisible hands. He recorded a private message, encrypted and stored in a secure vault. "If I fall, tell the world this: I did not kneel. Africa must never kneel." He then looked toward the horizon and said aloud, to no one, "Let them come." In a remote conference room beneath the Ministry of Defense, Traoré stood before a wall-sized screen displaying satellite feeds and intercepted diplomatic cables. The room was silent, except for the hum of encrypted data transfers. "Play it again," he ordered. The room watched as a covert video, grainy but undeniable, showed an Israeli intelligence officer meeting with a French defense attaché in Abidjan. The audio was scrambled, but the subtitles revealed all. "Destabilize him. Disrupt logistics. If he calls for Pan-African unity at the AU summit, intercept the stream. We cannot let this message go global." It was confirmation, not a rumor, not speculation. A plot backed by state actors to erase him, and Africa's new awakening, from global consciousness. Colonel Tapsoba spoke, his voice low. "Sir, this isn't just Israel or France. We've tracked financial flows from several multinationals, arms, disinformation campaigns, even NGO fronts. They're all playing the same game," Traoré replied. "But they forget we've learned the rules. The next move had to be bold. Waiting would only make him a target." Within 72 hours, Traoré assembled a covert task force, Project Ngoma. Its mission, not just defense, but retaliation. Cyber infiltration into European think tanks. Financial forensics to expose the flow of colonial-era wealth. And a covert operation to intercept a cargo ship docked in the Gulf of Guinea suspected of carrying destabilizing agents. At the same time, Netanyahu faced pressure from both his cabinet and international investors. The campaign to discredit Traoré had backfired in some corners of the global south. Leaders in Senegal and Chad began asking questions. Social media was ablaze with hashtags. Yes, Africa will not kneel. Traoré is not alone. In response, Netanyahu tightened his grip. He ordered Mossad assets in West Africa to increase pressure. But for every message they intercepted, Traoré's people were now planting their own. A battle of stories, a war of symbols. Traoré took the stage at the African Union summit via encrypted livestream. Just 10 seconds in, the feed cut. But within a minute, the same speech began streaming live on 150 mirrored accounts across the continent. We do not hate the West, but we will no longer be owned by it. You cannot colonize a soul that remembers who it is. Netanyahu watched from his war room in Jerusalem, silent. For the first time in months, he whispered to his aide, "Maybe we underestimated him." 3 days after the African Union summit speech, Burkina Faso's capital buzzed with something deeper than pride. It was resolve. Markets operated with normalcy, but murals of Traoré's defiant words now colored walls across Ouagadougou. You cannot colonize a soul that remembers who it is. But celebration was short-lived. At 4:17 a.m., an encrypted warning came through from South African intelligence. A multi-pronged disinformation campaign was live. Anonymous social media accounts pushed fake footage of Traoré abandoning his people. Bots flooded comment sections, stoking fears of regional war. On international news channels, analysts questioned whether he was fit to lead a fractured continent. By 8 a.m., Traoré convened his crisis circle. "These aren't just lies, they're weapons," said Adama Keita, his communications director. "They're trying to break our people's will." "They won't succeed," Traoré responded. "But we need to hit back harder." That afternoon, Burkina Faso's digital warriors deployed their counter-narrative. Real footage of community rebuilding, local leaders pledging allegiance, testimonials from African youth declaring Traoré their voice. Even more powerful, a leak emerged. An audio file, Netanyahu, speaking to a defense contractor. "If we don't stop Traoré, Africa will rewrite the global order, and not in our favor." The leak went viral in under an hour. The Israeli government claimed it was deep fake manipulation, but the damage was done. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu doubled down. He ordered a shadow project, a psychological operation meant to divide Traoré's alliances. Tribal leaders were to be bribed. Exiled military officers contacted. The old playbook of colonialism dusted off and reapplied. Traoré anticipated it all. His next move stunned the world. On national television, he stood beside representatives from Mali, Guinea, and Niger. A declaration was read, "We hereby form the Sahel Front. Any attempt to undermine one of us shall be considered an attack on all." It wasn't just military, it was ideological. From that moment, the line was drawn. Netanyahu's camp underestimated what it meant to unify proud nations with shared pain. But now, their common purpose burned brighter than fear. As evening fell, Traoré addressed the continent once more. "We have nothing left to lose except our chains." The world watched in silence. The war for Africa's soul had officially begun. In the days following the Sahel Front declaration, Africa stood taller, and so did its enemies. Western media outlets, suddenly synchronized, began pushing a narrative of rising instability. Netanyahu's diplomats worked overtime in Washington, Paris, and London, lobbying for sanctions against Burkina Faso and its allies. Words like dangerous populism and neo-nationalist uprising painted the picture they wanted. Traoré wasn't a hero, he was a threat. But within Africa, it was different. In Dakar, youth marched with placards reading, "Africa is not a client state." In Lagos, digital activists launched a viral campaign, #, "We stand with Traoré." Even in Johannesburg, once hesitant leaders now question their allegiances. Inside the Israeli Prime Minister's bunker, Netanyahu watched the momentum build like a storm. "He's not just uniting countries," he snapped at his inner circle. "He's resurrecting history, real history. That's more dangerous than any army." Netanyahu authorized Operation Glass Veil, a deep operation targeting Traoré's inner circle. The goal wasn't to kill, it was to fracture trust. A forged letter was sent to Malian President Goïta, suggesting Traoré had made secret deals behind his back. At the same time, Israeli intelligence fed fake intel to the French government. Traoré was planning to seize French embassies across West Africa. Both ploys failed. Traoré, suspecting misinformation, initiated a secret summit in Niamey. There, with no cameras and no speeches, the Sahel leaders sat face to face. They spoke of legacy, of how the world had divided them for centuries using whispers and bribes, and together they chose silence as their weapon. No rebuttal, no public outrage, just unity. Meanwhile, Traoré's domestic strategy intensified. He began nationalizing foreign-owned mines. Dozens of contracts tied to Israeli and French firms were suspended. "Burkina Faso's wealth," he said, "shall no longer enrich outsiders." The retaliation was swift. Economic sanctions were imposed. Aid was frozen. Several African countries were warned. Cut ties with Traoré or lose international support. But something shifted. Kenya's parliament voted to open diplomatic channels with the Sahel Front. Tanzania offered food supplies. Even Ethiopia hinted at intelligence sharing. A message was spreading like fire. The world may punish us, but we finally know who we are. Netanyahu watched the fire spread. Old strategies were failing, and the ashes of past empires no longer inspired fear, they inspired rebellion. The battle was no longer about territory, it was about dignity, and Traoré was winning. The silence unnerved them. In Tel Aviv, in Brussels, in Paris, they were used to noise, protests, cries, threats they could negotiate or extinguish. But Traoré's silence, deliberate and steady, was something else. It was discipline. It was planning. And it terrified them. Inside the Mossad Special Operations Unit, a new directive was issued. Disrupt the alliance, not with bullets, but with fear. Burkina Faso's progress had become infectious. Too many African leaders were watching Traoré not with skepticism, but with admiration. Israel launched covert economic disruption. Anonymous shell companies began offering bribes to officials within Sahel member states, attempting to reignite corruption. On Burkina's borders, weapons mysteriously flooded rebel groups long thought dormant. Social media disinformation surged, photoshopped images of Traoré sipping champagne in Paris, secret audio tapes of betrayal. Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he weaponized transparency. In a bold move, he opened all state financial records to the public. Every contract, every transaction, live, online, for all Burkinabe to see. Then he addressed the nation. "They want you to doubt me, doubt the movement, but look at the documents. Judge for yourselves. I fear no truth." It worked. Trust in Traoré surged to record highs. His approval among the youth, already strong, became unshakable. Older generations, once weary from decades of betrayal, began to believe again. Meanwhile, Netanyahu found himself cornered diplomatically. Egypt refused to denounce Traoré. South Africa released a statement recognizing the Sahel's right to self-determination. Even a former Israeli ally, Turkey, called for restraint and dialogue. The Prime Minister's frustration boiled over. "We don't need permission," he snapped. "We'll create the threat, then we'll be justified to act." A plan was set in motion, a false flag cyber attack on an African financial hub to be blamed on the Sahel front. It would justify economic retaliation and military posturing. But Mossad underestimated the digital firepower Traoré had quietly built, with allies from China and Iran. The plot was exposed live on a hacked global broadcast. The world watched in shock as Israeli IPs, fake African signatures, and internal memos were displayed on screens across major cities. Burkina Faso's message appeared in bold text at the end of the broadcast. "If we fall, it will not be in the dark. Africa sees now. Africa remembers." For the first time, Netanyahu realized something terrifying. He wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting a continent that had stopped bowing. The days following the cyber exposure were unlike anything Africa had seen before. From Nairobi to Lagos, from Kinshasa to Dakar, people poured into the streets, not to protest, but to declare something else: unity. Traoré had awakened something raw and generational. His stance against Netanyahu's shadow war had become a symbol, not of nationalism, but of continental dignity. Billboards went up in capital cities. Burkina stands, so do we. African news anchors began every broadcast with a new phrase: "Welcome to the new Africa." But in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu was reeling. His intelligence teams scrambled to contain the fallout. Embassies were being burned in protest. Israeli investments in African tech and mining ventures were frozen. Even American senators began questioning Israel's aggressive covert tactics. Traoré wasn't finished. He took the stage in Bamako during the Sahel Union's emergency summit, broadcast live across the continent. "We were once divided by chains, now we're linked by scars. But scars remind us, we survived." He paused, then lifted a simple, worn-out flag, the original Pan-African colors. "They offered silence for our gold, fear for our futures. But we will answer with fire and peace on our own terms." The crowd erupted. Cameras zoomed in on leaders from Niger, Mali, Guinea, all nodding. And then the unexpected happened. Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Kenya, the three powerhouses of East Africa, announced a joint security pact with the Sahel Union. Netanyahu had hoped to isolate Traoré. Instead, he had ignited a Pan-African revolution. That night, Traoré received a secure message from an anonymous source inside Tel Aviv. "They're desperate. They've authorized something irreversible. Watch the skies." He didn't sleep. The next morning, Burkina Faso's satellite defense grid, which had never been activated in real combat, lit up with warnings. Unidentified drones, Israeli signature masked, were approaching key Sahel energy installations. This was no longer about destabilization. It was about war. Traoré called an emergency broadcast. "To those who strike in shadow, we are no longer your colony. The continent is awake. You strike one, we unite all." Sirens wailed in Ouagadougou. Missile batteries locked onto incoming targets. Traoré stood calmly at command. "If it begins, let it begin with us. But let it end with a new world." The countdown had started. The first drone struck at 2:16 a.m. local time. It was fast, silent, and designed to be deniable. But it didn't matter, because Traoré's forces were waiting. Burkina Faso's newly coordinated Sahel air defense network, linked with satellites from Mali and Nigerian support, intercepted the drone in mid-air. A flash of orange split the night sky over the Koudougou Basin. Then came four more. But this time, the missiles didn't just intercept, they retaliated. Sahel drone swarms, previously rumored but never confirmed, launched from hidden bases in the desert, chasing the signal back to the source, a mercenary-operated facility in the borderlands of Chad. Within hours, the world knew. Not only had Netanyahu's operation failed, it had been exposed in real time. CNN. Breaking. Israeli-linked drone strikes intercepted in West Africa. Burkina Faso responds. Al Jazeera. Traoré's forces retaliate, unify African defense networks. Even the Israeli public, already weary of Netanyahu's shadow wars, began to question everything. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré addressed his war council. His eyes were tired, but his voice thundered. They struck at night, but we are not afraid of the dark. Across the continent, young leaders rallied. In Accra, students marched under banners that read, "Africa bows to no one." In Addis Ababa, Prime Minister Zerihun declared a 24-hour solidarity blackout to honor the defense of Burkina Faso. But the most dramatic moment came when a private recording leaked. A voice believed to be Netanyahu's saying, "If Africa won't be bought, it must be broken." That sentence was replayed on every African news channel for days. It was the match that lit the continent's rage. Traoré responded publicly from the Grand Assembly Hall. Africa is not for sale. Africa is not to be broken. Africa is becoming. The chamber roared. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's cabinet fractured. Intelligence directors resigned. Protests erupted outside the Knesset. And in the Sahel, the final preparations were underway. Not for all-out war, but for something more dangerous. A reckoning. Traoré met in secret with 4 African heads of state under moonlight. They signed the Kaya Accord, an agreement to establish the continent's first autonomous intelligence alliance free from Western or Eastern control. "We were once pawns," Traoré whispered. "Now we build the board." The final act was near. The world awoke to silence, ominous, expectant, electric. In Jerusalem, Netanyahu was nowhere to be found. His jet had disappeared from radar over the Mediterranean, with speculation ranging from political exile to a self-imposed vanishing act. The Israeli cabinet declared a state of internal emergency, but the story had already left him behind. In Ouagadougou, a stage had been built in the central square, draped not in military banners, but in symbols of unity. The flags of 15 African nations, and a simple white cloth bearing 5 words, "We bow to no empire." Thousands gathered, not just Burkina, but Senegalese, Nigerians, South Africans, Kenyans, farmers and tech entrepreneurs, elders and children. As the sun rose, Traoré walked to the podium, unarmed, alone. Cameras from around the world locked on. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't deliver threats. He spoke with the gravity of someone who had nothing left to prove. They offered wealth. We chose dignity. They sent weapons. We responded with truth. They threatened to divide us. But Africa has remembered its name. He paused, gazing at the massive crowd. Let this be our final message. Africa is not rising. Africa has risen. The roar was unlike anything ever recorded. Moments later, encrypted videos were released across global networks, footage of covert meetings between foreign agents and private contractors, documents proving attempts to sabotage African infrastructure projects, recordings of calls linking foreign governments to destabilization plots. It was the greatest intelligence leak in Africa's history. Israel denied involvement. The U.S. called for restraint. France went silent. But none of it mattered anymore. Africa had declared its sovereignty, not through war, but through unity, exposure, and defiance. The Kaya Accord was expanded into the Pan-African Defense Compact, pledging cooperation on intelligence, cyber defense, and space exploration. Meanwhile, Traoré disappeared from public view for 40 days. When he returned, he wore no military uniform, just a plain white robe and a message written across his chest. I serve no throne. I serve the people. That image went viral. 1 billion views in 72 hours. And Netanyahu? History absorbed him. A chapter. A warning. A relic of a world that thought Africa would always kneel. But Africa remembered, and never again would it forget. In a world where power has long been measured by weapons, wealth, and whispers in dark rooms, one voice from Africa echoed louder than all the rest. Traoré didn't just face down a global power, he reminded the world that a continent long overlooked has a soul, a spine, and a future it writes for itself. This was more than a conflict between two leaders. It was a reckoning, a shift. Africa will not bow, Africa will not be bought. And as long as men like Traoré stand, Africa will never be broken.